In medieval times, nearly everyone in Western Europe belonged to the Roman Catholic faith. And although not every person was a sincere believer, this was a time when most people held deep religious beliefs. In fact, about 1 out of 10 medieval people became monks or nuns, devoting their entire adult lives to the service of God, locked away behind the walls of monasteries. 800 years ago, lords and ladies supported the church with income from manor lands, and often paid the wages of priests as well. Noble families helped to maintain parish churches in the villages on their estates, in part because they believed that such acts of generosity would help them reach heaven. Wealthy nobles also paid to have beautiful funeral monuments made, and to have prayers and masses said for the souls of their family members after death. Even the poor serfs were expected to give 1/10 of their crops to support their village church, even though it was a great hardship for them. And although travel was dangerous in medieval times, some people made long pilgrimages to holy shrines as acts of religious devotion. But what medieval people are really the most famous for are the huge cathedrals they built all across Europe. These cathedrals, with their soaring towers and delicate stonework, are not only great monuments to faith, they are equally great monuments to the skill of medieval architects, artists, and builders. It took hundreds of years to construct most medieval cathedrals, but when they were done, they were truly magnificent places in which to worship, places that filled people's hearts with the mystery and glory of God. Their towering walls held brilliantly colored stained glass windows, depicting sacred images and stories from the Bible. These windows served to instruct churchgoers in religion, because back then most people could not read or write. Sculptors were kept very busy carving stone for new churches, and their incredible designs give us a glimpse into the medieval imagination. Directly over the doorway of this French cathedral is a stone carving with a powerful reminder about the consequences of sin. It shows the day of judgment. Here God is depicted as the large figure in the center. At his left hand, those who led lives of sin are being condemned to an eternity of suffering in hell, while on his right hand, those who led good lives are being rewarded with an eternity of happiness in heaven. It is interesting that, unlike ordinary people, most members of the clergy could read and write, and in a time before the invention of the printing press, it was the clergy who copied books by hand. It was also during the medieval era that the Catholic Church founded nearly all of the great European universities. In medieval society, a cathedral like this one was the special church of a bishop. Bishops held a high position in the church and belonged to the same feudal class as the noble lords. They also possessed great political power, because in medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was more powerful than any feudal state.
The role of religion in the Middle Ages. The medieval church played a far greater role in medieval England than the church does today. In medieval England, the church dominated everybody's life. All medieval people, whether they were kings, nobles, or serfs, believed that God, heaven, and hell all existed. From the very earliest of ages, the people were taught that the only way they could get to heaven was if the Roman Catholic Church let them. The local church was the center of town life. People attended weekly ceremonies. They were married, confirmed, baptized, and buried at the church. The church even confirmed kings on their throne, giving them the divine right to rule. The Catholic Church became very rich and powerful during the Middle Ages. People gave the church 1/10 of their earnings in what is called a tithe. They also paid the church for various sacraments such as baptism, marriage, and communion. People also paid penances to the church for their sins they committed. The wealthy often gave the church land. Eventually, the church owned about 1/3 of the land in Western Europe. Because the church was considered independent, they did not have to pay the king any tax for their land. Leaders of the church became rich and powerful. Many nobles became leaders, such as abbots or bishops in the church. The leader of the Catholic Church was the Pope. Right below the Pope were powerful men called cardinals. Next were bishops and abbots. Even bishops held a lot of power on the local level and even served on the council of the king. Many churches were built during the Middle Ages. The biggest of these churches were called cathedrals. Cathedrals were where bishops had their headquarters. Cathedrals were built to inspire awe. They were the most expensive and beautiful buildings built. Sometimes construction on a cathedral could take 200 years to finish. Most cathedrals were built in a similar fashion. They generally were laid out in the shape of a cross. They had very tall walls and high ceilings. Around 1100 CE, cathedrals began to be built with a new style of architecture called Gothic architecture. With this style, the weight of the vaulted ceilings rested on buttresses rather than on the walls. This way the walls could be thinner and taller. It also allowed for tall windows on the walls. Some of the great art of the Middle Ages was produced in cathedrals. This included stained glass windows, sculpture, architecture, and painted murals. Although Christianity dominated Europe during the Middle Ages, there were other religions. These included pagan religions such as the Viking worship of the god Thor. Other religions included the Muslims and the Jews, which lived throughout many cities in Europe. Throughout the late Middle Ages, conflict would arise between these religions that would greatly impact the people living in Europe. Interesting facts about the Catholic Church and cathedrals. Conversion of a country generally took place from the king down. Once the king was converted to Christianity, his nobles and people followed suit. Some master masons were able to work on a single cathedral for their entire life. Cathedrals and churches were often used for meeting places when large locations were needed. Catholic bishops often sat on the king's council. Churches provided education and looked after the poor and the sick.